I'm the Secretary General of the Swedish section of Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, WILP. And yes, it is hard when I mingle. But I'll tell you a little bit about WILP, but first I want to introduce our two speakers. We have Edda Manga from the Department of History of Ideas at the University of Gothenburg. I'm very glad to have you here. And we have Cynthia Enloe, feminist rock star, we've been calling you. But also a professor, working on feminist perspective on militarism, for instance. We're very, very glad to have you both here. And also we have you guys, who are also experts on your reality. So I'm hoping that we can have a conversation in this seminar. I know we're quite a lot of people, but I think we can make it happen. But we're going to start off with us three discussing for just a little while to get a stand. I'll tell you a little bit about WILP. It's an international women's peace organization, a feminist peace organization. I'm from the Swedish part, and then there's more than 30 other WILPs or IKFF in other countries. And we've been doing this for quite a while. We turn 100 years next year. So one of the reasons why we're arranging this seminar is that we've seen fascism before. We've protested against it before. And as I said before, I'm born in the 80s, but we have an institutional memory in our organization, and we see that we need to discuss these questions now. And it's part of our feminist perspective and also our peace perspective. And that's why we're specifically talking also about fascism and militarism, and a feminist perspective on those issues. So that's why we're here. And it's also quite appropriate we're in the room Taikon. And I can tell you, you know of Taikon? Katarina Taikon and also her sister Rosa Taikon are activists working for human rights in Sweden. She was a Swedish Roma activist who really put the issue of racism against the Roma population in the spotlight in Sweden. There's discrimination and racism that's still very much happening now in Sweden and in the rest of Europe, and I'm sure we'll touch upon that issue again. So, just to get us all on the same page, I thought we could just start off with talking a little bit about these concepts. So, if you would explain to all of us a little bit that when when we talk about this very overwhelming, in a way, concept of militarism, how do we grasp it? How do we even begin to grasp what it is? Cynthia?
I think I used to, you tell me if that's, tell our techie. Does our techie think this is better? Okay. When I first started thinking about militaries, I thought I could talk about the institution of the military. There's some very particular countries that don't have militaries. And of course, you know Iceland, but also Costa Rica. Other countries have considered not having a military. And I'm very interested in that. I'm very interested in the politics of militaries, of recruitment, of the imagery. That's all really matters to me a lot. The influence that military officers have in foreign affairs in their own countries, in other kinds of questions about sexuality. I'm interested in all of that. But it took me a while to realize that actually that was too small a focus, too narrow a focus. That what I was missing was, why do so many civilians support their military? Or why do so many civilians, sometimes more eagerly than uniformed officers, support military solutions to domestic problems or to international tensions? And once I began asking that question, first of all, I had to get a lot of new skills that actually weren't ones that I had. I began asking questions about militarism at about the time that I was really becoming much more of a feminist. And that was a really lucky thing, because becoming a feminist meant I also was gaining new skills. As all of you know, if you're always becoming, you're never fully there. All right? If you're trying to become and stay and expand what it means to be a feminist, you develop all kinds of new skills, new curiosities, new questions to ask, new things to watch. You drive all your friends crazy. But one of the things that really helped me in moving from the politics of militaries to the move it any way you need to. Good. From the politics of militaries to the politics of militarism is that it was feminist curiosity that allowed me to really engage more deeply in thinking about militarism. So let me tell you what I mean by that. I began to realize that militarism is a whole, it's not one idea, it's not two ideas, it's not even 5 ideas. It's a whole package of assumptions, beliefs that sometimes turn into assumptions because you don't ever question them again, right? But also values. So let me tell you what I mean by that. Beliefs are what you think human nature is, right? So if you think that, and a lot of us have beliefs about human nature that we don't even articulate until we meet somebody else who doesn't have that same view of what is human nature. And then you realize, really? You think that? And then you realize you had beliefs about human nature that you didn't even know you had. You thought it was, quote, normal. So one of the parts of the package that can become militarism, full-blown, is that you think that human nature is, by definition, is naturally, in quotes, selfish, self-centered. If that's one of the things that you think is a normal way to think about not only your human nature but everybody else's, then in fact you're not automatically a militarist, but one small building block is in place. Right? If you come to believe, none of us are born believing any of these things, you come through your own experience, your own upbringing, maybe the cultural path that you've been raised in, whatever it is, you also come to believe, and you think it's kind of normal to believe it, that conflict is normal amongst human beings. That is really how humans relate to each other. That it is not historically specific, it is not culturally specific, it is kind of part of the human condition, that there will be conflict between humans. Added to that, so the building blocks are building, right? Added to that is that you think that in some circumstances, violence is really maybe the last resort, but it's a necessary last resort to have access to. That just is, it makes sense. It is normal. And your beliefs, my beliefs, are not fixed. They get reinforced, or they sometimes get diluted through whatever experiences you've had, what kind of school you've gone to, who your friends are, the extent to which they share that belief, so that makes it feel more normal. Do you also develop the idea that having enemies is a natural part of the human condition? You know, in kind of Law and Order detective TV shows where you get to see policemen always after the murder, right? Always ask somebody, well, did so-and-so have any enemies? I always think that's the strangest question. I mean, I don't know how many of you, if somebody asked you, well, do you have any enemies? It just sounds weird to me. It doesn't sound weird to any of the script writers who write these television police procedurals. I mean, they all ask it, don't they, in every language. And you can see, what the good thing is, you can always see the stage, the actor witness say, no, I don't think so. But to the extent to which you actually, and you probably do have friends, acquaintances, family members who actually think it is normal in the world for humans to have these things called enemies. These are all building blocks. They are building blocks that are beliefs, right? And beliefs are very hard to get to. That is, you have to do an archaeological dig on yourself to find out your own beliefs. Most of us don't know all the things we believe until we meet somebody who doesn't believe them, right? But the other part of militarism is values. Now, values are what you think are worthy or unworthy. Values are what you think in raw terms, what you think is good or bad. So, for instance, a value would be that going into your country's military is likely to make a, quote, man out of a boy. Okay? Now, Anne Wright and I and others know that that's never the question asked for women, right? You're going to learn a trade if you go into the military, right? But, in fact, it would be very hard to recruit women into the military, and most militaries now need women. It would be very hard to recruit them if, in fact, the value of a woman going into the military, it will make you a man, right? But for values are gendered, and so one of the values that is very widespread, and you hear it amongst mothers, for instance, and that is mothers who are having a very hard time with teenage boys, with their sons, really hope that the military will be a surrogate parent and will kind of pick up where the mother feels she can't do anymore. She tried everything. And that the military will do the finishing of making an adult out of an adolescent boy. The other thing, another value, and this is a whole package now, right? So we're not going to talk about every one of them because we want to have time for discussion. But another value is to think that your country is not really a mature, and that's usually the term used. It's a loaded term. Your country is not really a mature country unless your country has a state military. This was the argument used to Haitians after the overthrow of the military dictatorship with the American-led military intervention, but with a lot of Haitian civilian support. The Haitians tried to decide, should the new Haiti, post-coup Haiti, should the new Haiti have a military? And a lot of Haitians, especially Haitian feminists, but other Haitians as well, said, we are done with militaries, right? Militaries have not been good for this country. And they had to be persuaded that Haiti wouldn't really be seen by others as a mature state if it didn't have a military. Now that's a value, right? It's a value about what makes for mature, what's a criterion for being mature in the international, if I dare use the word, community, right? So I'm going to stop at this point, but what I wanted just throw out there is that when we're talking about militarism and about any of us becoming militaristic, we become militaristic by not saluting more than we used to. We become militaristic by adopting a set of beliefs about ourselves in the world and about how the world works. And we adopt a set of values that maybe we didn't grow up with. Or maybe we grew up with in a very diluted form, but we become more convinced about them. The good thing about watching militarism over time, which means watching what I call militarization, the IZA part, is that it's very hopeful. because it means it has to be adopted, which means you can stop it. That there is nothing automatic about militarization. That is the adoption of these values and these beliefs. It can be stopped. It can be reversed. So that, I'll leave that over to Edda to give the less optimistic point about where we are.
Thank you, Cynthia. And we're going to come back to...
Absolutely.
You've given us a building block for the discussion also. Yeah. Before that, I want to give all of you who have come and are lacking a chair the opportunity to come up here. There are free chairs up here.
And there's two in the middle. I can see right
there's
next,
chairs here and here.
Right?
So you don't have to... You're okay back there.
Okay,
great. I'm also going to say, which I didn't say, that if there are questions like I'm not following or... so I will open up for questions, but if there's something that you don't understand for now, please raise your hands. I can translate from English to Swedish. And also if you have questions but are not comfortable in asking them in English, I'll happily translate Norwegian, Swedish, or Danish. If there's Icelandic or Finnish, we're going to need a translator in the middle, and then we can go. But so don't feel hesitant to ask questions just because you're not comfortable in English.
Great.
That was something that I wanted to ask. But I was talking just before now with you, Edda, about putting us in a context. Like, why are we talking about fascism now? What is happening in our country and in the, as we're at the Nordiskt Forum, in the Nordic context? So we have a baseline when we're going to discussions about fascism and militarism and feminism. That would be perfect.
I think it's not only a Nordic development, but a European development. We see many signs of fascism rising. But lately, because I have been, and I'm sure you have read that time when I was completely black, and I was seeing the 30s everywhere, and I said, well, I recognize the European fascism when I see it. But history, of course, doesn't repeat itself, and now I'm seeing something different from what I saw before. And it has something to do with what is happening in Sweden right now. So I will start by saying, well, what is fascism? Also, the term of fascism is very difficult. There is no consensus among historians of what fascism is. But I think one definition that can tell us something about what is happening in our time defines fascism as an ideology that thinks of the nation as in decadence. And the decadence is attributed to some foreign force. It's not necessarily racial foreign source, but it can be different from the norm in another way. It can be people that are different in sexual matters or in functional matters, or any kind of different from the norm. But so the story is that the nation is in decadence because of this foreign force in relation to the people, and the fascists see themselves as a movement that is going to repair this, to create a kind of reborn feeling in the nation, so that the nation becomes as it was before, as in the golden ages. And if you follow this definition, you will find that there is fascism in many countries, and in the Nordic countries, and in Sweden actually we have a fascist party and a parliament. many people, this is a controversial notion because we have different notions of what fascism is. So many people will say the Swedish Democrats are not a fascist party. But if you follow this definition, which is a definition that is it's by Robert Griffin, who has studied fascism, the history of fascism. He's a professor in Britain. If you follow this definition, you will find that many parties in Finland and also the Swedish Democrats and also what is happening in Norway and so on is fascism. And what I see that I didn't see before. Before it looked like this is a homogeneous what's that? Wall.
A wave.
Wave. A new wave of European fascism. Now, what is happening, and this happened in the elections for the European Parliament, is that we see that this is not an homogeneous wave, but in some countries the fascism is detained or going back, and in other countries it is advancing. So, for instance, we saw what happened with Front National. They take 25 places in the European Parliament.
The French.
The French, yes. And 25 persons is more than whole of Sweden has in the European Parliament. But in countries like Spain, where you see the tendencies of Franquism coming back in legislation, prohibition of abort and many different legislations that they want to change the democratic rights of people. We had the fascist forces going back in this election, and the parties that comes from indignados coming in the European Parliament. And in Sweden, we had the first feminist member of the parliament elected. And she is also now, there is one person that is Rome in the European Parliament, but she is the second one in Rome person in the European Parliament. So what we see is a polarization. And we see very strong forces. I don't know, for those of you that were in Gothenburg 1st of May, some of you were there, yeah? You can feel the force of feminist anti-fascism. It is very strong. And this happens also in Spain, and it happens in different places in Europe now. So I will say the same as I saw for 1 year ago. There is fascism, according to some definitions, rising in Europe. And of course, you haven't, or nobody has forgotten Breivik. Mm-hmm. We had also in this city, in Malmö, we had Mangs. Mm-hmm. And he was also a lone wolf. Because fascism also has its own methods of activism. And they developed this idea of lone wolf to awaken the people. And they kill serial killers like Breivik, but also like Mangs that just choose some people from that he perceived as from outside the country and killed them. People that he didn't know, just in the street like this. And this is a notion that also is common in the US So what is happening is, of course, that both of these forces are rising, and we have a polarization right now. And where I think the theme of this session is very relevant, because anti-fascism is feminist, and many of the fascists recognize feminism as one of the big menaces for the nation.
And hopefully we can talk a little bit more about how feminism is and how that works, how you can use it as a tool. But just a follow-up question on what you were talking about now, when we're talking about fascism. We use different words. You hear extreme right-wing, or sometimes racial or racist parties, or what else do we use? Nationalistic parties. Is there a difference there in what we label them, or what we call this? Some parties have even been Nazi parties, like what's it called, Golden Dawn in Greece, for instance, which is openly Nazi. Is there a difference in what we?
Yes. Actually, and this is a very difficult question, because many times when you try to talk about fascism, it can be a way of not seeing what is happening, like Putin is there. When you say right-wing extremists, it is in the notion that they are few and they are extreme, and they have nothing to do with the mainstream. And I think this kind of vision, it misses the point, because what mainstream and fascist ideologies have in common is, of course, nationalism, and they are very near. And of course, because we have this very dark legacy in Europe of colonialist past and racism as a principle of distribution of resources. So I think that when you analyze what is happening, you must see the imaginary of the white man, and how privileges are attached to this position. Some people, like that are fascists, they are in fact trying to defend the what is this, born birth rights of being white males, and so I think that I don't use the notion of right-wing extremists, because for the first, it is very complicated to say that they are right-wing. If you look at right-wing as a notion of economical distribution, that is the notion that rich people should get most, and poor people should get less, or you should redistribute so that some people that are worth or more worth should get more. It is not completely clear that all fascism will agree, because they are nationalists, and they can be kind of left in the vision of social security, about distribution of richness within the nation. What they are against is the outsiders, or what they define as outsiders.
Do you think that's relevant for the Swedish Democrats, for instance, when you're talking about this?
I think that they have, in fact, there is a difference between ideology and what they really do. Because in ideology, they are not left in social security matters and in economical matters. But in fact, they have voted all the time with the right. So you have these fissures. But of course, well, you can use the right-wing notion if you want. Then you must define what right is, and that's complicated. And the other nation you mentioned was...
I think I said nationalist, racist.
Racist. As for racists, most of the fascist groups, according to my definition of fascism, in Europe they are not racist in the meaning that they have they distance themselves from the notion of biological races. But if you make an ideological analysis of what they mean by culture, for instance, you will find that they are in fact racist, because they think that you can see with your eyes who are Swedish or who are not, or who are Norwegian or who are not. So in the definition of what Swedishness is, it is implied. But if you call them racist, you will get problems, because they take distance from this notion very explicitly. So of your three notions, I will keep nationalism, and I will say ultranationalism. They are ultranationalists in the meaning that they think that the most important political questions of all is the nation.
Cynthia, do you want to comment on this? Because now we're touching upon nationalism, and nationalism, it's a lot of isms. And we're going to talk a little bit about how another ism, the feminism, can be one method of understanding all of this. But your comments on this, and also if you can perhaps link it to what you were talking about, because nationalism and militarism were...
Well, I think one of the things that, I'll come back, but just one of the things that struck me is that to become a fascist, and I want to keep underscoring that, which says nobody has to be, it's not inevitable, right? But to become a fascist usually means you do adopt a very strong sense that there's an enemy. And I think Edda's point about the very growing sense amongst somebody who's becoming more fascist, the sense that there is decay, and it's a decay that is threatening, and it's a decay that's caused by something, and that something is your enemy. That really leads to an absolute openness to become militarized, right? Even if your first impulses were not about military might or using weaponry or becoming a soldier for the cause, in quotes. Even if you didn't, if you begin to really absorb the idea, you begin to think it is common sense that there is a profound threat to your soul and the soul of this thing you imagine as the nation. And you think that threat is an enemy that must be stopped. You are going to be much more easily convinced that taking up violence will make sense to handle or stop that threat of the decay that you think is challenging your very being and the being of the nation. Now, the idea of the nation, and we all know this here in the room, but the idea of the nation has been very empowering for women in many different specific settings. I mean, how many women became empowered during the Vietnamese mobilization against the French? One of the most striking examples I remember learning was this in the 1920s, when a lot of women and men in Vietnam really became nationalists for the first time, because for the first time they began to value things about being Vietnamese that the French colonialists said were worthless about the Vietnamese. So, for instance, one of the women's nationalist projects in the 1910s and 20s was to create for the first time Vietnamese cookbooks. Because for the first time, women had been told that only Chinese cuisine or French cuisine, those are your choices. If you were going to be a sophisticated, civilized person in the early 20th century, those were your two culinary aspirations. The idea that you'd actually want to encourage your daughter to learn how to make traditional Vietnamese dishes was thought of as an impossible thing for a good mother to do. So a nationalist women's project was to create Vietnamese cookbooks that valued traditional Vietnamese dishes. Now, I use that example because a lot of what nationalism has done for many women in many parts of the world, or for women who are in oppressed ethnic minorities, as versus ruling ethnic minorities, oppressed ethnic minorities within larger multi-ethnic empires, is to value things that are considered women's knowledge. That is, to value women as mothers, to value women's raising of children, to value women's culinary skills. Those sorts of things, for a nationalist cause, are oftentimes newly politicized, so that a woman who finds that she is valued in the nation as a political being, it's very, well, first of all, it's surprising, but it's also very invigorating. So we shouldn't imagine that nationalism always is masculinized. One of the things that Ho Chi Minh did was to say, if you don't mobilize Vietnamese women, you'll never be able to overthrow the French, right? And Mao Zedong, the first essay that young Mao, he was a librarian at the time, young Mao ever wrote was against the oppressiveness of new brides by their mothers-in-law, which was causing very high rates of young bride suicides. And he wrote about why are young women who are newly married, why is there such a high rate of suicide? Right? This is in the early 19-teens. So we need to take on a kind of warning, right? That don't imagine that the nation and a cause that supports the nation is always so obviously patriarchal that every woman, thinking, caring, activist woman will be appalled by it. Because in fact, in many countries, nationalism has been the route through which many women who thought they were never valued in the public space come to see themselves as valued in the public space. Now, I think what also happens, and many of you know this better than I, is that once a movement becomes a nationalist movement, it oftentimes shows its masculinized, privileged side. And you can see a lot of women who've become, and maybe some of you have had this experience, who have become energized, politicized, for the first time saw themselves as public beings through nationalism, also begin to see where the, if you will, nationalist glass ceiling is. And you will see in, for instance, Nicaragua, one of the reasons that there's an autonomous women's movement now was because of the critique of the masculinization of the Sandinista movement, which portrayed itself as a nationalist movement against a local autocrat, right? Somoza. So one of the things that happens with the nation is the nation becomes described by those who have the power to foist their descriptions of the nation on the rest of the movement or the rest of the general citizenry. The nation becomes a nation of patriarchal, sex-defined roles. So the woman will be empowered as a mother, but she has to keep prioritizing being a mother. Even if she joins the nationalist military force, at the end of, if they manage to topple the oppressive government or throw out the colonial forces, she will then be told by the male leadership that she should now reprioritize what should have been her priority all along. For the duration, in quotes, for the duration, she took this exceptional role of holding a gun and fighting for the nation. But of course, that's not her true cause. Now, when the autocrat or the colonial power is ousted, she should reprioritize what the nation needs her most to think of herself to be, which is a good wife and a caring mother. So that we know this, about this disillusionment, because women who've become politicized through nationalism have told us, right? It's not us, standing up above and watching nationalist movements say, ha ha, It's because Egyptian women have told us this in the 1930s, right? It's because Nicaraguan women have told us this in the 1990s. It's because Vietnamese women have told us this in the 1980s, right? So I think the nation is a very powerful idea for both women and men, but it becomes a highly patriarchal idea in which women must play a part, but it's a prescribed part. I guess what I'm just putting out there is kind of a warning that nationalism, and we can talk about fascism's appeal for women too, because there's that we should never imagine that nationalism cannot be very appealing to women who are not themselves militaristic and not themselves fascist. It makes it harder to really create a thoughtful feminist movement that is critical of nationalism. But it means you have to listen, all of us, have to listen really hard as to what is so appealing, so invigorating, so empowering for many women about being part of the nation. But of course, feminists are smart anyway, so of course you take on the difficult challenge, not the easy one. People who are critical of nationalism without any feminist curiosity, they're much more simplistic, I think.
Do you want to comment, Edda, or maybe we can talk a little bit more also about what you're saying? It's not the simplistic analysis, but how then can we use feminism? And I also want us to both take this on from a broader perspective, but also I think many of us, at least I've experienced that person that you were just talking about in the beginning. The person feeling, well, there is something here, it is deteriorating. We even have, I think it's a Facebook page. I'm not a racist, but, how you open yourself up. How would you talk to that person who's not a curious person, who's not perhaps an open person, but I want to reach that person in these discussions? How would
certainly listening to their fears. What makes people anxious?
I think if you take the Swedish context, we had social democrats that were nationalistic in kind. But they took this nationalism and make a folkhem. People's home.
Homeland, yes.
They called folkhem.
And social project.
And one very, very genius thing that Olof Palme, was to attach the idea of equality to national identity. So that you should be proud to have the value of equality. As a Swedish persons, we are equal and we stand up for equality. And this was universalistic in its appeal. I think that both the nationalist part, the nationalism of Sweden, of course, had many good things, and it had many bad things, excluding minorities, excluding people that were perceived as defect, as human material. We had racial hygiene laws for a long period in our history here. But I think that if you see this double, because it is always that every tradition has many lines and are complex. And if you see the complexity of the Swedish nationalism, also including universalistic values and seeing themselves or ourselves, I will say now after 30 years in this country, if I may. You can also understand the force of anti-fascistic and anti-racistic feminism, because it is grounded in an idea of Swedishness as equal, and it is operating and it is effective in this sense. But of course, all the other parts are functional too, and that we see also. Where you have military conflict, women will be raped. And so there is, and I think that this is this describes something of the idea of the method of defending equality. That militarism in itself, it is a threat to gender equality, and now in our time we have the idea that because we have women soldiers, we will equalize the military gender-wise, and we have also in Sweden grounded in the idea that we can export gender equality. We have created an office that is trying to export. It's a part of the Swedish military, and it is trying to export gender equality to other countries where Sweden has military engagement. Now, there is a ethnologist called Alma Persson, and she was embedded in some troops that were going to Afghanistan, and she was looking if the Swedish military has some gender equality in its ground so that it can export it. And I think that the negative results of her investigation shows us this very difficult ideological, that this idea of the gender equality that is going to be exported by the Swedish military has not ground in any empirical world. It doesn't exist, but it is a part of what Judith Butler called the frame of war. That is the ideological setting in which our ideas of the human are changed so that it is legitimate to kill other people.
We have a
question
here, and Cynthia comment also.
No, I'll leave it there so we can have more comments, and I'll get my word in. Don't worry.
Nice, thank you. My name is Selma, and I'm thinking about more of a solution to, instead of having increased fascism, how can we change that? And also kind of a reflection on your question, the last question there, that for me, I feel that I can experience this idea of gender equality in Sweden as an idea, but not as something in practice, because a lot of people think that they are gender equal because they were born in Sweden, and they don't have to do anything about it. Yeah, no, so if I can just, I don't mean that if we would measure that it's not if you compare and stuff like that. I just feel that having if our start out point kind of is that we need to protect something, then it's that we also own it. And I'm thinking of a solution instead of increased fascism and instead of increased beliefs in that we are different and we need to protect ourselves and our families from each other. How can we together, how can feminism be used to develop different goals and different ideas? How can we use that as a tool? Because I do also feel that there is a lot of good stuff happening in Sweden, that there is an open society where we can discuss these issues. So how can we make the world also more open? Not like us, but us too and everybody else, instead of not protecting what we have, but how can we together do something else? How can we, as you said in the beginning, how can we stop the development of militarization and fascism and change that? What is your, if we can maybe talk about how feminism can be a solution? Thank you.
Yeah. I think one of the things that, there is no one feminism, but one of the things that happens as one, I think, develops one's own feminist consciousness and one's own feminist way of being in the world, you realize that one of the things you try to do is to lower other people's fears, right? You try to kind of get out of the defensiveness that in fact structures so many social relationships and so many institutions and so many budgets, that you really find, I've got to be managed, constantly managed. But you realize that one of the things that you try to do is find another way. This is what feminist organizing is all about. Just think of how much hard work all of you have done in every small feminist organization you've ever been in to try and, because it takes work, right? To try and get everybody who comes, whatever the coming is, everyone who comes to feel included enough that they will be candid, right? But in that very micro setting, what one's trying to do is lower the barriers of defensiveness so as to lower the barriers of exclusiveness. And that takes a lot more skill than building a Saab jet fighter. I mean, it's a skill, and it takes a lot of work, and it takes a lot of investment, right? But it's a different kind of investment, and it's a different kind of skill. This comes back to Netta's question about who gets to decide what's a measure. And it's usually not recognized as being a skill, an investment with an enormous benefit if we can all do it and continue to do it. I would just like to underscore something that Netta said, because your question there is a very good one, I think, and that is, don't we need militaries to protect what is good about any of our societies? And it really grows out of the notion that we're always under threat, right? Now, to say that we aren't under threat sounds naive, and that's, of course, one of the easiest ways to dismiss feminism, right? It's not wrong, it's just naive, right? But in fact, if you couple that understanding of alternative modes of not protection, but alternative modes of genuine security, which is a little different, I think, right? Then, in fact, you find yourself trying to answer the good question you put is, so what would be alternative skills? What would be alternative investments? Because a military, even a military, what's the percentage of women in the Swedish military? I usually can do this off the top of my head for almost every government. What's the current percentage?
5.3 percentage of women, of soldiers.
Oh, so of all the Swedish people in uniform, 5.3 are women? No, that sounds too low for Sweden. Is that?
It's because of a
Oh, well, I mean, I thought I was going to have to make a hard case. Oh, well, okay. So,
You said it was higher?
I think it's if we included the civilian
Okay,
force,
it's
it's 13%.
oh yeah, so maybe,
in
yeah.
uniform,
Yeah. So, I mean, you know, New Zealand is one of the highest now. It's about 17%. South Africa is now quite high. Australia is high. High, none of them break 20%, right? And so the thing about using not just a military, but militarized notions of protection or defense to protect something that you cherish is one of the first questions to ask. Is that military institution giving that privileged position of it's us or the deluge, right? What kind of institution do we think is going to defend the things we cherish? Equality, in the true sense, democracy, in the true sense, justice. Because, as we say in the United States, military justice is an oxymoron, right? But you can say that about democratic militaries are an oxymoron. The place in most countries that have militaries where you can, without a question, be deprived of your right to privacy is the military. But it's also that militaries, it's not just the percentage of women in the militaries, is how masculinized do they have to become in order to be accepted, not to mention have a career, in that thing called the military. So that you pick an institution to be your main bulwark for the things you cherish, that is an institution that itself is based on the opposite of everything you cherish. Although, if you value a certain kind of masculinity, or you value a certain kind of technical sophistication in the wielding of the workings of violence, you may admire that military. It may turn out you cherish that actually more, right? But it is, I think it's just such a risk to make your main bulwark, your main mode of protection of the things you cherish, an institution and a set of values that are the opposite of what you think you're trying to protect. Many people will try to still rationalize it. You know, most countries of the world still do a pretty good job on their citizenry of rationalizing it, and up go the defense budgets, right? But actually, it doesn't work. Right? Sorry.
We have a few more questions.
I'm Malin from Finland, and I think also this was equality as a part of your identity. I mean, if you are talking about someone, I mean, we were the first one having the right to vote as a part of the whole nation. Is women and a woman and a man building the national nation together. So if you want to talk about how that is implemented, then I know the challenges there. But I also think there was Diana Molinari that wrote quite an interesting article in not the last bang, but in the bang before, that she had made interviews with women from the Sverigedemokraterna, the Swedish Democrats, and she was going to talk about gender equality, not about nationalism. And I got really like, oh, I would like to do this with the true Finns. Because she showed in this article that this also like when the enemy is from inside. I mean, what about if I'm the one creating the fascism? What if I'm the one that is creating this, that we have to protect something? If I'm one of these middle-class white feminists putting like, we are this is the folkhemmet, we could do similar in Finland. And all these people that can't live up to this picture, If you can't be all these great things, what is the thing that you can hold on to? This was what Diana said that she saw in these interviews. If you have nothing, but at least you have your Swedishness. You have your identity as a Swede. And then you always kick down. And that is something also that I see similar in like my country. We have 20% is voting for the true Finns. And they have this slogan, we say that's what people think. That, you know, that people do not tell how they feel about, that they feel marginalized in their own country. Of course it has to do also with the welfare state, that we are cutting it down. And then you want to blame someone. And I mean, in Finland we don't even have immigrants. So it's just that, you know, but you see, they just take the rhetoric and use it. So you can see also it's not empirical, that I think that what Edda was saying. I also see the same thing. It's not empirical. We have had the highest rate of violence against women in my country, and we are also winning in Sweden in many of these gender equality. I mean, what are we measuring? What is it actually about? And what do we want to defend? And what are we also creating in creating this nationality? So I would like to have a reflection on this, like the enemy from inside, because I think that question was good. That what can we do constructive? I think we have to be also self-critical. That how do I actually produce? I have friends that are true Finns, and in Sweden they're like, like my friends, I would never talk to them. I'm like, we have to have a dialogue. They are me. They are product. They are here. I can't put them out, and I don't want to see this radicalism of like that is also that we're taking up the weapons to fight back against the fascism. Then we're doing the same, and then the rapes will come. So reflection on this enemy.
Yeah, well, I had a train of thought that it just escaped me. Wait a minute. I would take this question of fascism not as a question of knowledge, as a question of desire, as a question of passion. And I will start by the psychoanalytical theory. If you find pleasure, like in the idea of Swedishness, the only way to replace mutiny is, I don't know this notion in English. It's very specialized. What is pleasure? In psychoanalytical theory, it's pleasure.
It's the one that Foucault uses.
Okay, so you must. The only way to change these things that are based on pleasure is to replace one pleasure by another pleasure. You cannot inform people out of this kind of pleasure economy. You must change one pleasure by another pleasure. And one problem that we have had is that our feminist or critical tradition has been very rationalistic, and it has been very universalistic, in meaning we have the concept of the human, of the universal human, and of course it has a lot of problems, but the ultranationalists or the fascists, they offer also not only a pleasure of being something, but also a community. And so I think that if we look at our history, we had a passion in the social democratic movement that was constructing this folkhemmet. And constructing it, you are constructing trust. That is what you talk. It's a very long process of constructing inclusion, constructing trust between people by de facto acknowledging that they are equally valued. that's what you do with the concept of folk. And so I think that the only way to create a strong resistance to fascism is to have visions of another way of being human and another way of being in a society, and to offer a place to be, to offer another kind of pleasure than the nationalistic pleasure. Thinking in this way, we had an idea, because we had the National Day the 6th of June, and I am in an organization called Clandestino Institute, and so we started for the first time the first International Day, the 6th of June, in Stigberget in Gothenburg, seeking other kinds of pleasure beyond the nationalistic pleasure. And of course, this is we mean it as a tradition, so it should come next year and be improved and so on and so forth. But I think that also this is something that the Feminist Party in Sweden has really understood. So they're trying to produce visions, and they are speaking in very emotive ways to people. And I think this is necessary. I think that in order to build up trust or love, if you want, as an alternative of how to relate to people, you must just do it.
Thank you. That's one very tangible way of moving forward, I think. But we had a question over here, and then let's continue on the how question as a le grand final of our discussion.
Well, okay, you say so much great stuff, so it's not much to ask really, but I just had a thought that I visited another seminar about peace and security with Josefine, and actually I think she introduced the thought that we have a very organized way of handling conflicts in the world by military, but we don't have any good strategies for avoiding conflicts, fear that leads to conflicts and stuff like that. If you have some thoughts about that, I think yes.
Well, I think this isn't the immediate solution. It is what is so tempting, what is so enticing about military solutions or militaristic military solutions. And one of the things that's so enticing is that it's an institution. And so it's an institution you can imagine directing to do something. It's an institution that when it goes into action, you can see it doing something. And that is very appealing. It's one of the things that makes one feel one is, as a citizen, if you're voting in that direction or you're accommodating it, you think you are part of a solution because you can see a particular institution doing something. And I think for a lot of us, to find alternative solutions mean we have to find ways to actually talk so that it's understood that we are in fact able to do things. We have methods, we have skills, we have strategies, we have attention to outcomes. And that means that sometimes it means having a much more skilled civilian diplomatic corps, if you're talking about parts of the state. It means that you have a lot more skills that are built up in schools so that children learn early on how to avoid conflict or diffuse tensions, and that they come home from school and say, Mommy or Daddy or, uncle, I learned something new today. I learned how to do something today so that when something about to happen in the playground, I made it stop. That is, so much of the appeal of using military force is that it's so easy in narrative terms to imagine the scenario. It never goes that way, of course, right? But it's still, you'll notice that time after time, failure after failure, it still is such an appealing scenario because our very underdeveloped human minds can tell the story that we want to have happen to solve the thing that we think needs to be solved. And we really have to develop skills and a narrative about those skills that are as understandable, make as much sense to people as send in the troops. It's a whole set of skills, but it is a set of skills that I think WILF is developing, a lot of you in other feminist groups are developing, and we have to call it a skill. We have to be able to name it, and we have to be able to show what it looks like. Because people need people, all of us, not those little people, all of us. We need narratives that make sense to us when we try to think about how to resolve something that we're afraid of.
And we're going to discuss that question also tomorrow. If you find the topic of militarism interesting, it's going to be me and Cynthia, or I'm going to be picking your brain again tomorrow, so please come then, because there are interesting questions in the Swedish discussion here. We had an introduction by one party here in Sweden that said they wanted to introduce a civilian peace corps, and it got chopped up. That suggestion got completely ridiculed, for instance. Why is that? So let's ask some questions about that tomorrow. But now, let's answer the next question here on the how, as the last comment before all the hugging starts.
That's part of the how.
Yeah. Sure, we have a how here.
Yeah, no, it's a question also. I'm sorry for my voice, because when you look at like the parties such as the Sweden Democrats or Front National in France, you see that they often belong, or the people that vote for these parties are people who belong to the underclass, or to the low working class, and often I believe that a lot of feminists that I know and that I work with, we come from like an academic family, and we have a big education and blah blah blah. And how do we meet these people? Because I guess that the people that are voting for the Swedish Democrats who are not in the parliament, they are not racist, they just feel threatened by something. And how can I, as a privileged woman, as an academic, meet those kind of questions? Because I think that is really important in the feministic analysis as well, to not just laugh at people on the internet with like, oh, they can't spell when they write hate messages to me. I mean, that is a problem.
I think what you say is very, very important. And when I was talking about the rearrangement of desire, we should talk critically about this, because one city and a community, and this community is based on distance from the enemy, the fascist. And when we apply this kind of logic in our rearrangement of desire as an anti-fascistic desire, we're reproducing the very ground of fascism. So I'm very, very grateful for your comment. I think I'm very opposed to the normalization of fascism in the public sphere. And because of my engagement against this normalization, I get a lot of comments from supporters of the Swedish party, and they call me a lot of things like cockroach, or the kind of thing. They say that I shouldn't speak because I'm not Swedish, and so on and so forth. And I start talking with them. I have talked with them a lot many hours in the internet, because they are anonymous comments, you know. So I engage in this conversation with them, and I have learned something very interesting. And this is that I often said to them, look at this film that was made by Aftonbladet about the income differences in Sweden. I say to them, you are looking at the wrong place. For the problem that you perceive in your life and in your body, you are looking at the wrong place to resolve this. Because if you look at this income, the money is not going to the invaders, you know. It is going to other classes of Swedish people that take it out to the tax havens. So look at this, and then you must have another kind of agenda to resolve the problem that you perceive in your life. And when I say this, they stop calling me a cockroach, and they keep silent. Some of them continue say, yes, you are telling truth, or you know. So I think that simply because one of the grounds of fascism is, of course, the decadence of the folkhemmet that provided people with some basic security. One way is constructing a society where people have this lowest level of security. And of course, we're not going to be able to construct it at a national level anymore, because we live in a global society. We must think bigger. We must think globally. Always, now in Europe, we have this European Union, and we have immigrants that are racialized like Romi people, and we're treating them very badly because we think that they are taking our privileges that we have from the colonial past, I mean our richness. They are taking it away from us. But in fact, if you look at the empirical world, it is not them that are taking anything. We have a problem of inequality within our society. And so I think the solution, it must be equalizing, and not only equalizing in a national level, but thinking broader.
Cynthia, you get the last comment on that, or the broader discussion, and then I'm going to try to do a little summary.
Why don't you go right into your... I don't like last words.
You don't like
We'll
say that tomorrow is your last word.
Yeah, right.
I'm sorry, but you're welcome to come up and ask your questions later on. I'm a very hands-on person, and I'm very grateful that there are minds that are greater than mine. But I was thinking of what you were thinking, and this discussion here has been quite an academic discussion. I mean, you're both academics, and many of the questions here, I'm assuming that many of you are also academics. But about the how, this is also, we need these discussions to have a base, to be grounded in what we then do. And the how is the love, but it's also, I would say, organizing. One thing that's amazing with Sweden is that we are members of more organizations within the civil society than most other countries. And if you're not part of an organization working for some improvement, then go there, join. That's where you will meet the people, that's where you will be able to talk to others. And it doesn't have to be Wolf or Feminist Initiative or other parties. You can join whichever organization, as long as you're grounded in this analysis. Join the butterfly collectors something, because there you will meet new people and you will have this basis that we all need, and then we can build on that. And I think I'm very hands-on in that way. I think it all boils down to then meeting people, and I'm very glad that we could meet you two to can you say fuel up? I don't know, I feel like I'm up to here after this discussion. And as I said, if you're interested in the topic of militarization, we have Anne Wright sitting up here, who's going to do a workshop on that tomorrow. She can tell you more about where that is. or later on you can listen to me and Cynthia again. And a big thank you to both of you and all of you who participated in this very warm room this late in the day, and now it's all up for grabs. Thank you.